The coffee mug slipped from Detective Ryan Collins' trembling hands, shattering against the diner floor like a gunshot in the pre-dawn silence. The third victim had been found at 5:47 a.m., and the crime scene photo spread across Booth 7 told a story that made seasoned cops lose their appetite for days. But Maggie Sullivan, the night shift waitress at Murphy's Diner who had been refilling his cup for the past 2 hours, calmly knelt down to clean up the mess while studying the photographs with the practiced eye of someone who had seen far worse things than a small-town detective could imagine. "Sorry about that, Maggie," Collins muttered, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "This case is eating me alive. 3 bodies in 10 days, and we don't have a single useful lead." Maggie carefully swept the ceramic fragments into her dustpan, her steel blue eyes briefly scanning the crime scene photographs that Collins had laid out in his exhaustion and frustration. What she saw in those images made her pause for just a moment, long enough to recognize the precise staging, the deliberate positioning, and the psychological signature of a killer she had studied extensively during her 15 years with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. "You want me to get you a fresh cup, detective?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of someone who had spent 12 years perfecting the art of being invisible in plain sight. "Welcome to those who left a trace, where ordinary people carry the most extraordinary secrets." Before we dive into this incredible story of a small-town waitress whose hidden past would crack the case that had an entire community living in terror, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that heroes come in the most unexpected forms, hit that subscribe button right now and join our community of over 600,000 subscribers who love these powerful human stories that prove anyone can leave a lasting trace. Collins nodded absently, too absorbed in the photographs to notice the way Maggie's gaze had shifted from helpful concern to analytical assessment. She had seen that exact pattern of victim positioning before, in case files that were sealed in the deepest vaults of federal law enforcement databases. The killer wasn't random. He wasn't opportunistic. He was following a methodology that she had helped profile during the darkest chapter of her career with the Bureau. Maggie Sullivan had arrived in Riverside, Pennsylvania, 12 years earlier with nothing but a battered suitcase, a savings account that would last 6 months if she was careful, and psychological wounds that ran deeper than the physical scars hidden beneath her long sleeves. To the 4,200 residents of this quiet farming community, she was simply the reliable night shift waitress who remembered everyone's usual orders, never gossiped about customer conversations, and somehow managed to be working whenever anyone needed a sympathetic ear or a hot meal at an unusual hour. What they didn't know was that Margaret Elizabeth Sullivan held a doctorate in criminal psychology from Georgetown University, had graduated summa cum laude from the FBI Academy at Quantico, and had spent 15 years as one of the Bureau's most effective criminal profilers. Her specialty had been organized serial killers, the methodical, intelligent predators who planned their crimes with meticulous care and often evaded capture for years or decades. Maggie's career with the FBI had been distinguished by an uncanny ability to understand the psychological drivers that motivated the most dangerous criminals in American society. She could examine a crime scene and immediately identify whether they were dealing with an organized or disorganized offender, predict the killer's demographic characteristics with remarkable accuracy, and anticipate their next moves with a precision that had made her a legend within federal law enforcement circles. Her success rate had been extraordinary. Over 15 years, Maggie had contributed to the capture of 17 different serial killers, including some of the most notorious cases of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Atlanta Highway Killer, who had murdered 14 victims across 3 states. The Chicago Apartment Strangler, who had terrorized urban areas for over 2 years. The Pacific Coast Predator, whose crimes had spanned from Seattle to San Diego. Each case had taken a piece of her psyche, requiring her to think like a predator in order to anticipate their moves and understand their motivations. Maggie had learned to compartmentalize the darkness she encountered in her work, developing psychological defenses that allowed her to maintain her sanity while diving deep into the minds of humanity's most twisted individuals. But the Jefferson City case had been different. The killer they were tracking had been targeting families with young children, breaking into homes in affluent suburban neighborhoods, and methodically murdering entire households with precision that suggested military or law enforcement training. The crimes were so carefully planned and executed that the killer left virtually no physical evidence, forcing the investigation to rely heavily on psychological profiling to identify potential suspects. Maggie had spent months developing a comprehensive profile of the Jefferson City killer, analyzing every detail of his methodology and psychological signature. She had identified him as a white male between the ages of 35 and 45, likely with military experience, probably employed in a profession that gave him access to detailed information about his victims' routines and security measures. Most critically, she had predicted that his escalating pattern of violence would culminate in an attempt to murder an entire apartment building or a similar high-density target. The profile had been accurate in every detail. FBI agents had identified and arrested David Kenna Morrison, a 41-year-old former Army Ranger who worked as a security consultant and had been using his professional access to case potential victims' homes. Morrison had confessed the murders of 23 people across 6 different crime scenes, and had indeed been planning an assault on a family shelter that would have resulted in dozens of additional casualties. But the psychological toll of spending months inside Morrison's mind had broken something fundamental in Maggie's ability to cope with her work. She had been forced to think like a family annihilator, to understand the twisted logic that drove someone to murder children in their beds, to anticipate the moves of the predator whose crimes defied every normal human understanding of morality and compassion. The breaking point had come during Morrison's interrogation, when he looked Maggie directly in the eyes and told her that she understood him better than anyone else ever had. He had described her psychological profile of his motivations with genuine appreciation, thanking her for finally giving him someone who could appreciate the artistry and planning that went into his work. That night, Maggie had gone home to her apartment in Quantico and realized that she could no longer distinguish between her own thoughts and the predatory psychology she had been studying. The line between profiler and predator had become dangerously blurred, and she knew that continuing her work would eventually destroy whatever remained of her humanity. Her resignation from the FBI had been immediate and final. She had submitted her credentials, undergone the mandatory psychological evaluation required for agents leaving the Behavioral Analysis Unit, and disappeared from federal law enforcement without accepting any of the private consulting offers or academic positions that were immediately extended to someone with her credentials and experience. Maggie had chosen Riverside specifically because it was small enough to offer anonymity, quiet enough to provide the peace she desperately needed, and unremarkable enough that no one would ask probing questions about her background or previous experience. The job at Murphy's Diner had been perfect. It required no special qualifications, offered flexible hours that accommodated her persistent insomnia, and provided just enough human interaction to prevent complete isolation without demanding emotional investment. For 12 years, the strategy had worked perfectly. Maggie had successfully reinvented herself as a small-town waitress, developing genuine relationships with regular customers while maintaining careful boundaries that prevented anyone from learning too much about her past. She had found a measure of peace in the routine of serving coffee, taking orders, and listening to the everyday concerns of people whose biggest problems involved crop prices, high school football, and local politics. But now, staring at crime scene photographs that displayed the unmistakable signature of an organized serial killer, Maggie felt the familiar analytical processes stirring in her mind despite her years of deliberate suppression. The killer's methodology was sophisticated, his victim selection was purposeful, and his crime scene staging suggested a level of psychological sophistication that local law enforcement would be completely unprepared to handle. Detective Collins returned to his seat with a fresh cup of coffee, spreading the photographs across the table with the desperate hope that staring at them long enough would somehow reveal a clue that had previously escaped notice. Maggie continued wiping down nearby tables, positioning herself to observe the crime scene materials without appearing to show any unusual interest. The first victim had been Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old real estate agent who had been found in the basement of a house she had been showing to potential buyers. The positioning of her body suggested the killer had spent considerable time arranging the scene to his satisfaction, creating a tableau that served some specific psychological purpose for him. The second victim was Michael Rodriguez, a 28-year-old insurance adjuster who had been discovered in his office after failing to return home from work. Again, the killer had taken time to position the body in a specific pose, surrounding it with personal items arranged in a pattern that seemed random to untrained observers, but carried clear psychological significance. The third victim, found just hours earlier, was Patricia Chun, a 31-year-old bank manager who had been killed in her own home. The crime scene showed the same meticulous staging, the same attention to symbolic detail, and the same absence of physical evidence that characterized the previous murders. Maggie recognized the pattern immediately. The killer was creating symbolic representations of his victims' perceived failures or inadequacies, using their deaths to express his own psychological narrative about superiority and control. The staging wasn't random. It was communication, a way for the killer to tell a story about himself and his victims that only someone with advanced training in criminal psychology would be able to interpret. More troubling was the escalating timeline. 10 days between the first and second murders, 6 days between the second and third. The killer was accelerating, driven by increasing psychological pressure that would continue to compress his cooling-off periods until he was killing every few days or even more frequently. Detective Collins rubbed his eyes and leaned back in the booth, clearly exhausted by the demands of an investigation that was consuming every hour of his life without producing any meaningful progress. "I don't understand how someone can just disappear after committing murders like this," he muttered, more to himself than to Maggie. "There has to be some kind of pattern, some connection between the victims that we're missing." Maggie refilled his coffee cup, choosing her words carefully. "Have you considered that maybe the connection isn't between the victims, but between the victims and the killer? Sometimes people choose victims who represent something specific to them personally." Collins looked up sharply, surprised by the insight from someone he had always considered a friendly but unremarkable waitress. "What do you mean?" "Well," Maggie said slowly, maintaining her role as concerned citizen rather than trained profiler, "all three victims were successful professionals, right? Real estate, insurance, banking. Maybe the killer has some kind of issue with people in those fields, or with successful people in general." The observation was deliberately surface level, offering genuine insight without revealing the depth of analysis that Maggie was actually conducting. In reality, she had already identified the killer's likely profession, age range, educational background, and probable relationship status based on the crime scene evidence visible in Collins' photographs. The killer was a white male between the ages of 30 and 40, with above-average intelligence and some form of professional training that had taught him planning and organizational skills. His victim selection suggested someone who felt professionally unsuccessful or underappreciated, choosing targets who represented the career achievement that he felt he deserved but had been denied. Most critically, the accelerating timeline and increasingly elaborate crime scene staging indicated that the killer was building toward a culminating event, a final murder that would be more dramatic and symbolic than the previous crimes. Based on the pattern of escalation, Maggie estimated that this final event would occur within the next 3 to 5 days. "That's actually a really good point," Collins said, making notes on a napkin. "I hadn't thought about the professional angle. All three victims were definitely successful in their careers, and they were all involved in fields that deal with money or property." Maggie nodded encouragingly while internally calculating the most effective way to guide the investigation without revealing her expertise. The challenge of providing enough insight to help catch the killer while maintaining her cover identity as a small-town waitress who happened to have good instincts about human behavior. Over the next 2 hours, as Collins continued reviewing case materials and Maggie went through the motions of her regular duties, she managed to offer several additional observations that nudged the detective toward more productive lines of investigation. She suggested that the killer might be someone who felt overlooked or undervalued in his professional life, She mentioned that the careful staging of crime scenes suggested someone with artistic or creative inclinations who was using murder as a form of self-expression. Each suggestion was framed as common-sense speculation rather than professional analysis, but together they provided Detective Collins with a more sophisticated understanding of the killer's psychology than he could have developed through conventional investigative methods. As dawn broke over Riverside, Collins finally gathered his materials and prepared to return to the police station for another day of frustrating investigation. "Thanks for letting me spread out here, Maggie," he said, leaving a generous tip. "And thanks for listening. Sometimes it helps to talk through these things with someone who isn't directly involved in the case." "Anytime, Detective," Maggie replied, already knowing that she would spend the remainder of her shift analyzing everything she had observed and developing a more comprehensive profile of the killer. Her retirement from the FBI hadn't eliminated her ability to think like a profiler. It had only forced her to be more creative about how she applied those skills. After Collins left, Maggie spent the quiet morning hours of her shift developing a detailed psychological profile based on the crime scene evidence she had observed. The killer was definitely organized and methodical, with above-average intelligence and strong planning capabilities. His choice of victims suggested someone who felt professionally inadequate despite having education or training that should have led to greater success. The symbolic staging of crime scenes indicated a narcissistic personality with grandiose self-image, someone who believed that his intelligence and capabilities were unrecognized by society. The accelerating timeline suggested increasing psychological pressure, probably triggered by some recent stressor in his personal or professional life. Most importantly, Maggie identified specific behavioral patterns that would help predict the killer's next moves. He would continue targeting successful professionals, but his next victim would likely be someone who represented an even higher level of achievement or social status. The crime scene staging would become more elaborate and symbolic, possibly involving multiple victims or a more public location. Based on her analysis, Maggie estimated that the next murder would occur within 48 hours, and that the killer would choose a victim who represented the ultimate symbol of the success that he felt had been denied to him. In a small town like Riverside, that would likely mean targeting someone like the mayor, the bank president, or another prominent community figure. The challenge now was finding a way to communicate this information to law enforcement without revealing her background or compromising the anonymous life she had built in Riverside. Direct contact with Detective Collins would raise too many questions about how a small-town waitress had developed such sophisticated insights into criminal behavior. The solution came to her during the afternoon, when she overheard two customers discussing the murders and expressing frustration about the lack of progress in the investigation. Maggie realized that she could use anonymous tips to guide the investigation toward more productive directions, providing crucial information while maintaining her cover identity. That evening, Maggie placed her first anonymous call to the Riverside Police Department, using a voice disguiser app on a prepaid cell phone to mask her identity. She provided specific suggestions about where to focus investigative resources, including recommendations about the killer's likely demographic profile and behavioral characteristics. "You should be looking for someone in their 30s or early 40s, she told the dispatcher. "Probably someone with professional training, but who hasn't achieved the level of success they think they deserve. Look for someone who has access to information about his victims' schedules and routines." The tip was detailed enough to provide valuable investigative direction, while remaining general enough to avoid suspicion about the caller's expertise. Maggie followed up with additional anonymous tips over the next 2 days, each one providing more specific guidance about the killer's psychology and likely next moves. Her profile proved accurate in every detail. Police investigation, guided by her anonymous tips, identified Harold Fitzpatrick, a 38-year-old former insurance adjuster who had been fired from his job 6 months earlier and blamed his professional failures on the success of others in fields he considered inferior to his own intelligence and education. Fitzpatrick was arrested while conducting surveillance on his intended fourth victim, the president of Riverside's largest bank. In his apartment, investigators found detailed plans for an increasingly elaborate series of murders that would have culminated in a mass shooting at the bank during business hours. The successful resolution of the case was attributed to good police work and anonymous tips from a concerned citizen. But Maggie knew that her intervention had prevented at least 6 additional murders and possibly a mass casualty event that would have devastated the small community. More importantly, she had proven to herself that her skills as a profiler could be used constructively without requiring her to return to the psychological darkness that had driven her from the FBI. She could continue living her quiet life in Riverside while occasionally using her expertise to help solve cases that local law enforcement lacked the resources or training to handle effectively. Over the following years, Maggie became an unofficial consultant to law enforcement agencies throughout central Pennsylvania, providing anonymous tips and guidance for complex criminal cases that required psychological profiling expertise. Her insights contributed to the resolution of numerous investigations, including several additional serial killer cases, organized crime prosecutions, and missing person investigations. Local law enforcement agencies began referring to their anonymous consultant as Guardian Angel, never suspecting that their most valuable investigative asset was serving coffee and taking orders at Murphy's Diner. Maggie's tips were always accurate, always helpful, and always timed to prevent additional victims, while providing investigators with the information they needed to identify and apprehend suspects. The arrangement allowed Maggie to maintain the peaceful life she had built in Riverside while using her expertise to protect communities throughout the region. She continued working at Murphy's Diner, developing deeper relationships with regular customers and becoming an integral part of Riverside's social fabric. But her most significant contribution was the development of training materials that helped local law enforcement agencies improve their investigative capabilities. Working anonymously through secure internet connections, Maggie created psychological profiling guides, crime scene analysis protocols, and investigative methodologies that were distributed to police departments throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. These training materials, developed from her extensive FBI experience and refined through her anonymous consulting work, became standard resources for law enforcement agencies that lacked access to federal profiling expertise. Her methodologies helped solve hundreds of additional cases and prevented countless crimes by improving local investigators' ability to understand and anticipate criminal behavior. 10 years after the Riverside murders, Maggie's training materials were being used by law enforcement agencies in 12 different states. Her anonymous consulting work had contributed to the resolution of over 40 major criminal investigations, and her methodologies had become incorporated into police academy curricula throughout the Northeast. The impact of her work extended far beyond individual cases. By improving the investigative capabilities of local law enforcement agencies, Maggie had created a lasting trace that continued to protect communities and solve crimes long after her direct involvement in specific investigations. Murphy's Diner remained the heart of Riverside's social life, and Maggie Sullivan remained its most reliable and beloved employee. Regular customers appreciated her consistency, her genuine interest in their lives, and her ability to remember everyone's preferences and concerns. They had no idea that their friendly neighborhood waitress was one of the most effective crime fighters in American law enforcement history. The trace that Maggie had left was measured not in recognition or official commendations, but in the lives that were saved, the criminals who were caught, and the communities that were protected by improved investigative methods. Her legacy was written in case files that would never bear her name, in training manuals that would never acknowledge her contributions, and in the peaceful lives of people who would never know how close they had come to becoming victims. Detective Collins, who had since been promoted to chief of police, occasionally stopped by Murphy's Diner for coffee and conversation with the waitress, who had somehow helped him see his most challenging case from a different perspective. He never learned that his casual conversation partner was the guardian angel whose anonymous tips had made his career and saved his community. But sometimes, when particularly difficult cases crossed his desk, Collins would find himself returning to Booth 7 at Murphy's Diner, spreading out case files and talking through the evidence with Maggie Sullivan. Her insights were always helpful, her questions always revealing, and her suggestions always seemed to point investigators in exactly the right direction. 20 years after leaving the FBI, Maggie Sullivan had created something more valuable than any official career could have provided. A network of improved investigative capabilities that continue to protect communities throughout the region, guided by methodologies she had developed and refined through decades of understanding the darkest aspects of human psychology. Her trace was invisible but permanent, written in the lives that continued because crimes were solved more quickly, criminals were caught more efficiently, and communities were protected by law enforcement agencies that had learned to think like profilers even when they didn't have access to federal resources. The quiet waitress at Murphy's Diner had left the most important trace of all, a legacy of justice that would continue protecting innocent people long after she was gone, ensuring that the darkness she had once confronted in her official capacity would never again go unrecognized or unchallenged in the communities she had chosen to protect.